The opinions expressed are those of the host. The material is for informational purposes only. It does not constitute investment advice, and it is not intended as an endorsement for any specific investment. Visit crestmontpw.com for more details.
Welcome to The Ascent by Crestmont Private Wealth. My name is Sam McGee. I'm the CEO and owner of Crestmont, and we have an office in Houston, Texas, and Boerne, Texas. Today, we're going to be talking about a bit of a niche topic. Now, some of you that are listening to this, it just may not apply, and I'm sorry. You can't deliver everything for everybody, but it is a really interesting topic to a lot of people in both of these listening markets and across the United States. So what we're going to be talking about is executive compensation, specifically restricted stock units. The reason I want to talk about restricted stock units is because typically we find that a lot of companies that issue them will do them after a fiscal year. Not every company has a fiscal year that ends on 12/31, but a lot of them do. And what we have found by working with a lot of professionals in the Ascent and the Summit, those are the 2 of 3 segments of life that typically we see getting restricted stock if they're working for a publicly traded company. We see that they get awarded these grants usually in the spring. Not always. Sometimes it's over the summer and fall. But a lot of times it's the result of how the business did in the previous year. Now, the first question you might be asking is, just because you might be interested, and maybe you don't work for a public company, maybe you do, and you really don't know how these things work. What is restricted stock? So restricted stock is simply a grant of a public security that has a restriction on it that is tied to a vesting schedule. So think about it like this. Let's say that I work for XYZ Corporation. And this is fictitious. I don't know if there's an XYZ ticker out there, but if there is, my apologies. XYZ Corporation, let's say, is a publicly traded company. And I happen to be a VP of operations at XYZ Corporation. And I had a really good year, and the company had a really good year. That was 2024. And my boss and the head of HR come to me and they say, "Hey, Sam, you've done great. We're going to give you a raise. And in fact, not only are we going to give you a raise, but we're going to go ahead and put you on this restricted stock program." And typically what that would look like is a grant. And that grant would usually be accompanied by some legalese that defines an agreement of how you would take possession or not take possession of those shares. And it will have something like a typical vesting schedule of, say, 3 years. Let's say that XYZ Corporation, they gave me 1,000 shares of a grant in 2025. And in this hypothetical example, what we would typically see from most companies that we work with is it'll be over like a 3-year period where I can receive 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3 of those 1,000 shares. So that basically means those 1,000 shares that I got up front are not that important to me right now, but we refer to those as golden handcuffs because over the next 3 years, I would get 333 shares on the anniversary date, typically, of that grant. So in 2026, 333 shares would become mine of XYZ Corp. And then 333 the following year on the same date, and then maybe 334 on the next date. Imagine if I did good every year, and the company did good every year, and they gave me these tranches of grants. They're going to start piling up, right? And so, wait a minute, what if XYZ Corporation is involved in a business that is a pretty up and down business? Let's just say it's maybe oil and gas as an example, pretty up and down business. And I'm paid by this company. And my livelihood comes from there. And now all of a sudden, I'm an all-star and things are going great and I'm getting all these restricted stock units. What is going to happen to my personal balance sheet risk? It's going to start increasing in that industry, increasing in that company. And no matter how much I believe in it, it's still a risk. Now, I'm not going to tell them no. I'm not going to say, no, I don't want those shares. But typically in that agreement of grant, you would have something called a change of control provision. Typically, not always. But say that XYZ Corp got taken over. Usually that's going to have a provision for a change in the security to the acquirer, or maybe even a immediate vesting. Not always. Always consult your grant if you do get restricted stock to really understand the change of control, involuntary and voluntary separation of employment. Because there are very specific rules on what is yours and what is not yours in all three of those circumstances. And take a look at the disability provisions too. What if you can't come to work? Or what if you die? Those things are really important. And I know here in San Antonio, in this area, and also in Houston, there are companies that have tons of these restricted stock units that are given annually to their high performers and middle management and future performers. And so it can be a big part of your wealth creation. That's why we're talking about this today. So one question that I get in our annual review with clients that have restricted stock is, what do I do with these when they vest, when they become mine? First off, let's talk about the typical way that they become yours and what that really means. So I'm going to use the example again of XYZ Corp. And let's say that I have those 333 shares coming to me February in 2026. And it's the anniversary date, and 333 shares in gross shares of XYZ Corp are now going to be mine. Let's say they're worth, I don't know, $100 a share. That's a nice little chunk of change coming to me, right? A lot of the companies will do something called net shares. That means that they will withhold for taxes for the Treasury a percentage. We usually see 25% on average. But out of the 333 shares, 25% will be withheld. And I will end up with 75% because 25% would be withheld for income taxes, because this is compensation. Now, what's interesting about that is, let's say that my tax rate is higher than 25% or it's lower. You're either going to have an overpayment or an underpayment. So that's something to pay attention to. That happens typically when corporations distribute shares to your brokerage account on a net basis. Now, I am not a CPA. I'm not a tax advisor. This is not tax advice. Consult your CPA for your specific situation. This is just something we typically see, and I'm using a fictitious example of XYZ Corp on restricted stock. The reason we talk about restricted stock on this show is so those that have restricted stock or may get restricted stock can learn about it, know a little bit more about it, know what to do, what to look for. It's a big part of wealth creation if you're working at a publicly traded company and you happen to be in a program where you receive restricted stock as part of your compensation package. Traditionally, companies are going to be using that for retention, reward and retention. So it's to reward high performance of the company, maybe the individual, the department. It can be used as retention too. They want to see you there. They want to see you in a few years. So that's why the vesting schedule is there. So it's what we call the proverbial golden handcuffs. So we see a lot of times individuals that are nearing the summit, which is what we refer to as the retirement phase at Crestmont, and they may have built up a significant portion of restricted stock, whether it's unvested or it is vested or a combo. And why does that matter? Again, I alluded to this earlier, but your balance sheet, your personal balance sheet, should be thoughtfully curated and thought through all the different latent risks by industry and company. No matter how much you believe in your company, at the end of the day, stock, restricted stock, carries risk. Whether you work at one of the most profitable companies in America or one of the least, and it's publicly traded, it's going to have risk. So at that time where the vesting occurs, we typically, not always, but typically will advocate for a diversification plan. At Crestmont Private Wealth, the way that we do that is we actually reach out to our clients that have restricted stock, and we tailor a solution for a diversification plan. That obviously has tax drawbacks as well as potentially benefits by resetting a basis, and all points are considered. One question that we do get at the time of vesting of restricted stock for someone is, hey, should I sell it now? Should I diversify it now? Should I wait a year? Now, here's the interesting piece that refers to this net shares example that I illustrated earlier. If you're paid in net shares and you paid the government out of your shares at the time of vesting, technically that resets the basis and the holding period typically on your security. Do you need to wait an entire year in order to diversify? The answer is no. Now, it could be yes for certain individuals, and it depends on the individual, but typically you're looking at a resetting of basis, and if you want to diversify at that point, consider the tax implications of the short-term loss or a short-term gain, but really you're talking about a new basis at that point anyway if you're paid in net shares. If I've lost you, it's probably because you don't get paid in restricted stock. But if I haven't lost you, I'm going to bring you back to center and talk about why companies do this. We're talking about restricted stock, public companies, and how those in the community that work for public companies that are high earners can be rewarded and retained through a compensation program called restricted stock. Restricted stock is simply publicly traded stock of the company where you work, and you are granted grants and units of restricted stock that may have a vesting period that would keep you around, the proverbial handcuffs, and to reward you for how well you've done and the company's done. This is a very common thing in public companies. We see it a lot with energy companies, some that I can't name, but we do work with quite a few energy companies in Houston and across San Antonio, and we see that their programs for restricted stock are pretty similar. It becomes one of these really interesting dynamics that as people work for a corporation for 15, 20, 30 years, they get really comfortable with the risk. Like a doctor working in an emergency room, the sight of blood is no big deal. It would really freak me out if I walked out of Boerne radio and saw blood everywhere. That would be scary. But if I was a doctor in an emergency room, it wouldn't bother me. That's how people that carry restricted stock get complacent. Same analogy. They get complacent about the risks of the company they work for, and they retain that risk because they believe in it. They might have an emotional tie to it. We do not advocate that. As a fiduciary, we want to be your advocate and help you sort through the risks that you may have in your portfolio, no matter how much you believe in the company where you work. Just like a doctor is going to want to operate and help you in the ER. You can reach us at info@crestmontpw.com. If you happen to be someone that has restricted stock and you're not really sure how it works, and this is just scratch the surface, and you need a diversification plan, reach out to us, crestmontpw.com or info@crestmontpw.com. Thank you, and God bless.